Hi, I'm Emily. I'll be your storyteller today. Many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Also, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable. Close your eyes and let the sound of the rain guide you into the story. The small, battered fishing boat, helmed by the equally weathered Mr. Finn, bucked and slammed against the churning gray waves, each impact sending a jarring shock through my already weary frame. Omen Point, or Ponta Agurenta, as Finn called it with a distinct lack of cheer, loomed ahead, a jagged black finger of rock stabbing out into the turbulent Atlantic. Rain, driven by a relentless late autumn wind, lashed my face, tasting of salt and an age-old sorrow. This desolate peninsula, with its lone automated lighthouse and keeper's cottage, was to be my hermitage for the next 3 months, a place of stark isolation, to finally wrestle my thesis on obscure maritime legends into submission. Mr. Finn had been a man of few words during the choppy, hour-long journey from the mainland village of Seabrook Haven, his silence as gray and impenetrable as the sea itself. When he did speak, it was in curt, cryptic phrases, his gaze often drifting towards the point, with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Respect, fear, or perhaps a deep ingrained weariness. She demands quiet. The point does, he'd grunted, his eyes narrowed against the spray. And she keeps what she's given. I had dismissed it as local superstition then, the colorful folklore I, as a historian, often encountered. Now, as we navigated the treacherous, foam-choked inlet leading to a tiny, precarious stone jetty at the foot of the cliffs, his words echoed with a new, unsettling resonance. The cottage, perched high above, looked small and vulnerable against the vast, turbulent sky, its stone walls darkened by centuries of salt and storm. Beside it, the lighthouse tower stood stark and white, its lantern hooded, waiting for the dusk that was already beginning to bleed into the bruised afternoon. There was a brutal, undeniable beauty to the scene, but also a profound, almost crushing sense of isolation that went beyond mere solitude. With practiced, if grudging, efficiency, Mr. Finn helped me unload my meager supplies, boxes of books, research materials, tinned food, and oil for the generator. He refused my offer of tea or assistance in carrying everything up the steep, winding cliff path, his gaze repeatedly flicking towards the darkening horizon and the increasingly agitated sea. Best be settled before the dark and the tide turn. Truly against ye, was his only comment, his voice almost lost in the wind's mournful howl. The cottage itself was as rustic and time-worn as I had expected, perhaps more so. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp stone, sea salt, and old, cold wood smoke. Furniture was sparse, heavy, and dark, seemingly hewn from driftwood or salvaged from wrecks. Yet it possessed a strange, undeniable charm, a sense of having weathered countless storms, of holding countless untold stories within its thick, resilient walls. The large stone hearth promised warmth, and the small, deep-set windows offered breathtaking, if somewhat terrifying, views of the raging ocean. The lighthouse tower, connected to the cottage by a short, covered stone walkway, was a silent, imposing neighbor. Its automated light, Mr. Finn had informed me, would activate at dusk, its powerful beam a solitary sentinel sweeping the tumultuous waves. I felt a strange mixture of comfort and unease knowing it was there. A beacon of safety for ships, yes, but also a constant, rhythmic reminder of my utter isolation on this forgotten tip of the world. I spent the remainder of the fading daylight unpacking, arranging my books and notes in the small, surprisingly, cozy study that overlooked the churning sea. The wind shrieked around the eaves, rattling the old window panes. But inside, with the fire finally crackling in the hearth, a fragile sense of peace began to settle over me. This was what I had sought. Solitude, a place where the distractions of the modern world could not reach, where I could finally immerse myself in the echoes of the past. Yet, as true darkness enveloped Omen Point, and the lighthouse beam began, its slow, deliberate sweep across the turbulent water, the silence within the cottage became almost oppressive. It was a silence that amplified every creak of the old structure, every skittering sound that might have been a mouse, or something else entirely. And through the wind's howl, I began to discern other sounds, strange, melancholic cries that were not of gulls, too mournful, too laden with an almost human sorrow. I told myself it was just the wind, its voice distorted as it tore around the cliffs and the lighthouse tower, playing tricks on my city-accustomed ears. But the cries persisted, rising and falling with the gusts, seeming to emanate from the very air around the cottage, from the tumultuous sea, from the dark, unseen coves below. They were unsettling, these unseen mourners of the storm, and they pricked at the edges of my carefully cultivated composure. Curiosity, or perhaps a nascent unease, drew me to explore the immediate surroundings before the last of the twilight vanished completely. I bundled up against the driving rain and stepped outside. The cliff path was slick and treacherous, the wind threatening to tear me from my footing. Below, the Atlantic roared, its waves exploding against the black, jagged rocks in showers of white, angry foam. The raw, untamed power of nature here was both awe-inspiring and deeply humbling. The peninsula was small, a narrow spine of rock offering little shelter. The vegetation was sparse, salt-blasted, clinging tenaciously to the thin soil. There were no other buildings, no signs of previous habitation beyond the cottage and the lighthouse. Yet the air itself felt ancient, steeped in forgotten histories, in unseen presences. The feeling of being watched, which I had dismissed earlier, returned with a new, unwelcome intensity. I saw Mr. Finn's small boat, a distant, bobbing speck, finally disappearing around the headland, swallowed by the rain and the encroaching darkness. His departure severed my last tangible link to the mainland, to the world I knew. A profound sense of isolation, far deeper than I had anticipated, settled upon me. I was truly alone now, on this storm-battered sliver of rock, with only the wailing wind and the strange, sorrowful cries of the unseen seabirds for company. As the first true night on Omen Point began to assert its dominion, the storm that had been brewing all day unleashed its full fury. The wind became a physical assault, slamming against the cottage walls, making the sturdy stone structure groan and tremble. Rain hammered against the roof and windows with the force of thrown gravel. The sea roared its displeasure, its waves reaching higher, their spray lashing the very cliff edge where the cottage stood. The lighthouse beam, a solitary spear of light, cut through the maelstrom, its rhythmic sweep a small, defiant gesture against the overwhelming power of the storm. Yet, even its familiar pattern seemed altered by the tempest, its light refracted and scattered by the sheets of rain, creating strange, dancing phantoms in the swirling darkness beyond my windows. The cottage, which had felt like a sanctuary, now seemed like a fragile vessel adrift in a sea of elemental rage. It was then, amidst the cacophony of the storm, that I heard them more clearly. Those other sounds, carried on the wind, yet distinct from its natural fury. There was a low, rhythmic booming, like a distant, colossal drum, or perhaps the impact of something immense against the cliffs far below, and woven through it, a faint, almost imperceptible metallic clanging, a sound like old chains being dragged across stone, seeming to emanate from the very earth beneath the cottage. My heart began to pound, a frantic counterpoint to the storm's wild rhythm. These were not the sounds of nature, not the ordinary protests of an old house settling. This was something else, something ancient and unsettling, awakened by the storm, or perhaps drawn by the solitary rhythmic pulse of the lighthouse beam. The melancholic cries I had heard earlier now seemed to hold a note of distinct, almost desperate warning. I moved from window to window, peering out into the tumultuous darkness, but saw nothing but the sheeting rain and the angry, churning sea. The sounds persisted, however, growing subtly louder, more defined, with each passing hour. The rhythmic booming seemed to be drawing closer, the clanging of chains more insistent. The air in the cottage grew colder, the fire in the hearth sputtering, as if a draft from some unseen opening was trying to extinguish its warmth. The initial sense of peaceful isolation I had craved was rapidly being eroded, replaced by a creeping, insidious dread. Omen Point was not just a place of solitude. It was a place of secrets, of ancient, an echo of Mr. Finn's cryptic warning. She keeps what she's given, returned with a chilling new significance. The lighthouse beam swept past my window, its cold, white light momentarily illuminating the room, and in that instant, it felt less like a beacon and more like a searching, pitiless eye. Alone in the storm-battered cottage, with the wind howling like a banshee and the inexplicable, ominous sounds from the darkness growing ever more pronounced, I felt a profound sense of foreboding settle upon me. My quest for historical legends had, I feared, brought me to a place where legends were perhaps still terrifyingly alive. The long nights on Omen Point promised to be filled with more than just academic research. They promised a descent into a mystery far older and far darker than I could have ever imagined. Several days passed in a blur of fitful work and watchful apprehension. I tried to immerse myself in my thesis, the familiar discipline of historical research, a welcome anchor against the unsettling atmosphere of Omen Point. The storms, however, were relentless, rolling in from the vast gray Atlantic with a regularity that frayed my nerves. Each tempest seemed to bring with it a fresh wave of those strange, distant sounds, the rhythmic booming, the clanging of unseen chains, which I stubbornly attributed to the violent sea and the peculiarities of the wind. I established a routine: rise before dawn, brew strong coffee, work for hours at the small, sturdy desk overlooking the turbulent waves, then a brief, bracing walk along the cliff path if the weather permitted, always keeping a wary eye on the treacherous footing and the churning water below. The automated lighthouse beam, my silent, sweeping companion through the long nights, offered a strange kind of comfort, a steady rhythm against the chaos of the elements, yet I could not entirely shake the unease it sometimes instilled. The melancholic cries of the unseen seabirds persisted, a constant, sorrowful counterpoint to the roar of the wind and waves. They were never visible, these avian mourners, always just out of sight, their voices seeming to carry on the gusts of rain and mist, lamenting some ancient forgotten tragedy. I told myself it was simply the peculiar acoustics of the cliffs, the way sound was distorted and carried by the fierce coastal winds, but the explanation felt thin, unsatisfying. My academic mind, trained in logic and evidence, fought against the growing sense of the uncanny. Omen Point was merely a remote, storm-battered headland, the cottage an old, creaking structure. The sounds were explainable, The isolation was to be expected. Yet, a part of me, an older, more primal part, listened to the wind's lament and the sea's roar, and felt a resonance with something far more ancient, something that whispered just beyond the threshold of understanding. Then came a night when the storm exceeded all previous fury. The cottage seemed to shrink under the assault, the stone walls vibrating, the windows rattling as if skeletal fingers were trying to pry them open. The wind shrieked not like a banshee, but like a chorus of tormented souls, and the rain hammered against the roof with the force of 1,000 angry fists. It was in the brief, terrifying lulls between the thunderclaps that I heard them clearly for the first time, no longer distant or ambiguous. Indistinct whispers, sibilant and chilling, swirled around the cottage, seeming to emanate from the very stones themselves, from the air, from everywhere and nowhere at once. They were too faint to discern words, yet they carried an undeniable cadence of speech, a multitude of hushed, urgent voices. And beneath them, from directly under the floorboards of the study where I sat frozen, came that horrifying, rhythmic, dragging sound, like immense, heavy chains being pulled slowly, laboriously, across a rough stone floor. My blood turned to ice. This was no trick of the wind, no settling of an old house. This was something else, something undeniably real and terrifyingly close. The whispers seemed to curl around me, cold and inquisitive, and the dragging sound beneath my feet vibrated up through the soles of my boots. A sickening, visceral sensation. I sat paralyzed, my thesis forgotten, my academic detachment shattered, listening to the house's hidden, horrifying symphony. When dawn finally broke, gray and exhausted, the storm had lessened, though the wind still moaned around the eaves. The whispers and the sound of chains had ceased with the receding darkness. Sleep had been impossible. My first rational thought was to find a logical source, some prosaic explanation for the night's terrors. This cottage was old. There had to be cellars, forgotten spaces, perhaps even old winches or mechanisms connected to the original lighthouse workings. Driven by a mixture of terror and a desperate need for a rational anchor, I began a systematic search of the cottage. I tapped on walls, listening for hollow spaces, examined floorboards for loose sections, peered into every dark cupboard and cobweb-laden corner. The main living area and bedrooms yielded nothing but dust and the scent of ages. The small kitchen, with its ancient iron stove and stone sink, was equally unrevealing. The unsettling sounds had seemed to emanate from beneath the study. The study floor was made of thick, dark oak planks, worn smooth by time. Most were firmly set, but as I ran my hands over them, one near the old stone hearth shifted almost imperceptibly under my touch. My heart leaped. With trembling fingers, I worked at the edges of the board, prying it upwards. It resisted then. With a groan of reluctant wood, it came loose, revealing not a gaping cellar, but a shallow, dusty recess beneath, and there, nestled in the accumulated grime of decades, lay a small, water-damaged, leather-bound volume. Its cover was warped and stained, its brass clasp green with verdigris. It was a logbook, clearly very old, its pages brittle and yellowed. A faint, musty scent, like that of a long-sealed tomb, arose from it as I carefully lifted it from its hiding place. This, I felt with a sudden, certain conviction, held answers. With a mixture of excitement and trepidation, I carried the logbook to the desk. The early morning light, though weak and gray, illuminating its fragile pages. The ink was faded, the handwriting an elegant, spidery script, but it was mostly legible. The log of Josiah Croft, principal keeper, Omen Point Lighthouse, read the inscription on the first page, dated 1873. This was it, a direct link to a past keeper, a voice from the history I had come here to study. I began to read, my earlier fear momentarily eclipsed by the thrill of discovery. Josiah Croft's initial entries were prosaic, detailing weather patterns, shipping traffic, the mundane routines of a lighthouse keeper's solitary existence. He wrote of the stern beauty of Omen Point, the majesty of the ocean, and his hopes for a quiet and diligent service in this remote outpost. His words painted a picture of a man of duty, of resilience, of quiet contemplation. He described the meticulous tending of the great lamp, the polishing of the lenses, the constant battle against the encroaching sea salt, and the fierce, unpredictable storms. There were notes on visiting supply ships, the rare interactions with fishermen from Seabrook Haven, and his observations of the local flora and fauna. It was, for the first several pages, exactly what one would expect from such a record, a testament to a life of isolated vigilance. Then, subtly at first, the tone of the entries began to shift. Josiah wrote of the peculiar stillness that sometimes fell upon the point, a silence so profound it felt like the world holding its breath. He mentioned the strange, mournful cries of unseen birds, the same sounds that had unsettled me, describing them as the lamentations of drowned souls. A thread of unease, almost imperceptible, began to weave its way through his careful, measured prose. He started to record local superstitions, tales told to him by the taciturn fishermen of Seabrook Haven, stories of an old one of the deeps, a powerful, ancient entity that dwelled in the abyssal darkness beyond the continental shelf, an entity that demanded respect, and sometimes appeasement. He dismissed them initially as the fanciful imaginings of simple folk, their minds addled by solitude and the sea's mysteries. But as I read further, his dismissiveness began to waver. He noted unexplained phenomena, strange, phosphorescent, light seen far out at sea on moonless, stormy nights, an unsettling rhythmic drumming sound that seemed to rise from the very rocks of the point during high tides. The disappearance of a small fishing vessel from Seabrook Haven, lost without a trace despite a calm sea. These were things he could not easily explain away. One entry, dated late in his first year, made my blood run cold. The men from the haven speak in hushed tones of the congregation, he wrote. A hidden sect, they say, who tend to the old one's needs, who understand the true purpose of this light. They say the beam is not just a warning to ships, but a focus, a channel. I fear their superstitions are beginning to infect my own mind, for the loneliness here is a potent incubus of dread. The logbook, I realized with a growing sense of horror, was not just a historical record. It was a chronicle of one man's descent into fear, a mirror reflecting the very unease that was beginning to take root in my own soul. The whispers I had heard, the dragging chains, were these mere figments of my imagination, amplified by the storm and isolation? Or were they the same phenomena that had plagued Josiah Croft over a century ago? The storm outside had quieted to a low, mournful sigh, but inside the cottage, a new, more insidious storm was gathering. The weight of Josiah's fear, his dawning comprehension of something terrible connected to this place, settled upon me. Omen Point was not just a desolate headland. It was a place with a dark, hidden history. A history that, I suspected with a chilling certainty, was far from over. My academic quest for forgotten legends had led me to the threshold of a living nightmare. The discovery of Josiah Croft's logbook became my sole obsession, eclipsing even my thesis work. The days that followed were a blur of deciphering his faded, spidery script, each entry pulling me deeper into the grim history of Omen Point. The weather remained stubbornly foul, a constant gray drizzle interspersed with bouts of furious wind and lashing rain, as if the peninsula itself resented my intrusion into its long-held secrets. The cottage felt colder, its shadows deeper, its silence now pregnant with the echoes of Josiah's dawning terror. His early fears about local superstitions soon gave way to a reluctant, then horrified acceptance. He wrote of the congregation of the tides, a name whispered to him with a mixture of reverence and fear by the rare, tight-lipped fishermen from Seabrook Haven who dared venture near Omen Point. Josiah described them as an insular group, bound by ancient pacts and strange, moonlit rituals performed on the treacherous, hidden beaches that lined the coast. Rituals intended to appease some unnamed power from the abyssal depths. The logbook detailed fragments of these rituals, gleaned from hushed, fearful gossip, or, chillingly, from Josiah's own distant, uneasy observations. He wrote of dark shapes moving on the shoreline during the new moon, of guttural chants carried on the wind, and of strange, glyph-marked stones placed at the water's edge, only to be claimed by the incoming tide. These were not the quaint folk customs I studied, but something far older, far more primal, and infinitely more unsettling. Josiah's entries became increasingly fixated on an entity, an old one of the deeps, that the congregation both worshipped and desperately feared. He described it as a being of immense power and unfathomable antiquity, its influence tied to the storms, the tides, and the strange, unnatural occurrences that plagued this stretch of coast. The lighthouse, he began to suspect, was not merely a beacon for ships, but played a crucial, though terrifyingly unclear role in this unholy relationship. He wrote of the light itself, how the villagers believed it acted as a watcher's eye, a steadfast gaze that either kept the entity at bay, or conversely, served as a focal point for its attention, a conduit for its power. Josiah's own observations led him to believe the latter. "The beam," he scrawled in one increasingly agitated entry, "does not repel. It calls. It draws something from the lightless chasms. I fear its rhythm is a summons, its arc a welcoming gesture to that which should remain forever undisturbed." This chilling interpretation of the lighthouse's function resonated deeply with my own burgeoning unease, with the strange attraction I had sometimes felt emanating from its rhythmic sweep. I found myself watching the beam with a new, horrified fascination, imagining it not as a guardian, but as an antenna, broadcasting a silent, ceaseless invitation into the storm-tossed darkness of the Atlantic, calling forth an unimaginable horror from the crushing pressures of the deep. The logbook spoke of disappearances, fishing boats vanishing in calm seas, lone travelers on the coastal paths never seen again, all attributed by the congregation to the old one's displeasure, to a lapse in their rituals, or to the entity's insatiable periodic hunger. Josiah, a man of science and reason, initially scoffed, but his entries chronicled his own slow, dawning terror as unexplained events mounted, as the line between superstition and horrifying reality began to blur beyond recognition. One particularly, stormy and fog-drenched night, after hours spent poring over Josiah's increasingly frantic script, I felt an overwhelming urge to look out towards the sea. The fog was a solid, impenetrable wall, the rain a relentless assault against the glass. The lighthouse beam cut a swathe through it, a futile gesture against the oppressive, luminous white. And then I saw them, just as Josiah had described with trembling, ink-blotched words. spectral bluish-green lights, dancing and weaving far out on the turbulent waves, where no ship could possibly be. They moved with an unnatural, fluid grace, sometimes submerged, sometimes cresting the storm-tossed waves, their glow faint yet undeniable against the blackness of the sea and the white opacity of the fog. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, a silent, ghostly armada converging, slowly, inexorably, towards Omen Point, towards the lighthouse. My breath hitched in my throat. The passage I had just read from Josiah's log described this very same phenomenon, an event he had witnessed with unutterable terror over a century before. The logbook slipped from my numb fingers, falling to the floor with a soft thud. This was no longer history. This was my present, my reality. The past was not dead here. It was a living, breathing entity, its horrors replaying themselves, and I was an unwilling participant in its grim, cyclical drama. The spectral lights on the water continued their slow, mesmerizing advance, their eerie glow reflecting in my wide, terrified eyes. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, watching those impossible lights. But eventually, they faded, sinking back into the depths or consumed by the fog, their departure as mysterious as their arrival. The storm still raged, but the specific terror of that spectral congregation had passed, leaving me shaken to my core. The logbook's horrifying tales now imbued with the undeniable weight of personal experience. Sleep, I knew, would be a distant, unattainable shore that night. The following days were a torment of heightened senses and gnawing fear. Every creak of the cottage, every moan of the wind, every strange cry from the unseen seabirds now seemed to carry a sinister personal import. Josiah's logbook became my constant, dreadful companion, its pages filled with a fear that was now my own. I rationed my reading, yet was drawn back to it, unable to resist its horrifying narrative, its foreshadowing of my own potential fate. The isolation of Omen Point, once a desired commodity, now felt like a crushing weight, a vulnerability. The vast, indifferent ocean stretched to the horizon, offering no escape, only the promise of more storms, more secrets from its lightless depths. The mainland village of Seabrook Haven, my only link to the outside world, now seemed less a place of potential succor, and more the source of the very darkness that permeated this accursed peninsula. It was with a mixture of profound dread and a desperate, illogical hope for some form of contact, some break in the oppressive solitude, that I heard the unmistakable chug of a boat engine a few days later. Mr. Finn was returning, presumably with the fresh supplies I had arranged for before. This latest descent into terror, the weather had momentarily cleared, a fragile, watery sunshine breaking through the bruised clouds, but the air remained heavy, charged. He secured his boat at the small jetty, his movements as economical and unhurried as ever, his weathered face giving nothing away. As he began to haul the crates up the steep cliff path, I met him halfway, forcing a semblance of normalcy, of polite gratitude. He nodded curtly, his eyes, however, lingering on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. They were like chips of sea-worn flint, ancient and unreadable. "All well at the point, Miss Anya?" he asked, his voice the usual low rumble. Yet there was a subtle inflection I hadn't noticed before, a probing quality that set my teeth on edge. "The storms have been fierce. Some say they stir up more than just the water." His gaze flicked towards the lighthouse, then back to me, a silent, knowing challenge. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, how much he already knew or suspected. "It's an old house, Mr. Finn," I said carefully. "It makes its share of noises. In the wind." His lips curved into what might have been a smile, but it held no warmth, only a kind of grim, ancient amusement. "Aye," he said. "She has many voices, Omen point, and she speaks loudest to those who are listening." His words, so close to Josiah's own musings, so unnervingly perceptive, felt like a confirmation of my worst fears. He knew. The villagers knew. They were all part of this ancient pact, this terrible secret. "Have you been comfortable in your research?" he pressed, his gaze unwavering. "Found any interesting old stories in the cottage, perhaps? Some keepers, they say, left their marks, their warnings." The implication was clear. His questions no longer casual but targeted. A subtle interrogation. He was probing for what I had discovered, what I understood. The isolation of Omen Point suddenly felt far less about solitude, and far more about being observed, perhaps even contained. The logbook, hidden back in the cottage, felt like a dangerous, incriminating secret. My carefully constructed academic detachment was no match for this primal, deeply rooted dread. With a final lingering look that seemed to see right through me, Mr. Finn finished unloading the supplies and prepared to depart. "The tides will be turning soon," he said, his voice flat. "And the mist will be rolling in thick tonight. Best keep your lamps lit, Miss Anya. Some things prefer the darkness." His words were a clear, unmistakable threat, a chilling promise of the night to come, leaving me alone once more with the terrifying knowledge that the horrors of Omen Point were not just confined to the past or to the depths of the sea, but walked among the living in Seabrook Haven. Mr. Finn's veiled threat about the encroaching mist and things that prefer darkness left an icy residue in the already chilled air of the cottage. His departure was a relief, yet it plunged me into an even deeper sense of isolation and suspicion. People of Seabrook Haven were not just insular. They were complicit, guardians of a secret that Omen Point seemed desperate to reveal through its storms and its sorrowful spectral phenomena. Josiah Croft's logbook now felt less like a historical document and more like a desperate contemporary warning. In the days that followed, the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. It was no longer a vague unease, but a distinct prickling sensation on my skin, the feeling of unseen eyes following my every move. Whether I was hunched over, my research in the study, or battling the wind on the cliff path, the ancient stones of the cottage seemed to breathe around me, and the wind, as it whistled through unseen cracks, often carried whispers that sounded chillingly like my own name, drawn out and mournful. The mist, as Finn had predicted, rolled, infrequently, a thick, white, almost tangible presence that swallowed the landscape, reducing my world to the immediate confines of the cottage and the looming, indistinct silhouette of the lighthouse tower. It muffled all sounds, creating an eerie, expectant silence, broken only by the rhythmic, mournful sigh of the foghorn, a sound that now seemed less a warning to ships and more a lament for lost souls, or perhaps a call to something ancient in the deep. It was after one particularly violent storm, which had raged for 2 solid days, trapping me inside with only Josiah's increasingly terrifying entries for company, that I ventured down to the small, treacherous cove at the foot of the cliffs. The tide had receded, leaving behind a tangled mass of seaweed, driftwood, and debris. But amongst the usual flotsam, other, stranger objects lay strewn across the wet, black sand, objects that made my blood run cold. There were pieces of oddly carved dark wood, almost like fragments of ancient totems, their surfaces worn smooth by the sea, but still bearing faint, unsettling glyphs that mirrored some of Josiah's sketches. Scattered amongst them were smooth, jet-black stones, arranged in small, deliberate circles, as if placed there by unseen hands only moments before. And half buried in the sand, glinting dully, was a small, tarnished silver locket, its chain broken, its surface etched with a design I couldn't quite decipher, my heart hammered against my ribs. I remembered Josiah's fearful descriptions of offerings left by the congregation of the tides, strange tributes washed away by the sea, meant for the Old One of the Deeps. These objects felt undeniably ancient, imbued with a chilling aura of ritual and sacrifice. The locket, in particular, felt heavy with an unspoken sorrow. With trembling fingers, I prized it open. Inside, instead of a portrait, was a tiny, perfectly preserved human tooth, a child's tooth. I recoiled in horror, dropping the locket as if it had burned me. This was no mere superstition. This was evidence of something truly grotesque, a dark pact that stretched back through centuries, its tendrils reaching into my present. I scrambled back up the cliff path, the image of that tiny tooth, that innocent, horrifying offering seared into my mind. The wind seemed to carry mocking laughter, and the sea below churned with a new, more personal menace. Back in the cottage, I frantically searched through Josiah's logbook, my hands shaking. And there it was, an entry describing his own discovery of similar objects after a great storm. Tokens of the sea devil's dew, the fishermen had called them, their faces pale with fear. He wrote of a silver locket found containing a child's first lost incisor, an offering made, they claimed, to ensure safe passage for the village fleet, or to appease the Old One's periodic, terrible hunger. The parallels were too exact, too horrifying to ignore. The rituals Josiah had chronicled were not just history, they were ongoing. The congregation of the tides, or whatever they called themselves now, were still active, still making their dreadful offerings to the entity that dwelled in the lightless depths. And Omen Point, this isolated, storm-battered finger of land, was their sacred, terrible ground. The sense of being an unwelcome intruder intensified, mixed with a chilling fear that I might inadvertently become part of their next offering. The presence within the cottage itself grew bolder, more assertive. It was no longer just a feeling of being watched or subtle, unexplained sounds. Objects began to move. My carefully arranged research notes would be found scattered across the study floor. The heavy logbook, which I always kept beside my bed, would appear on the mantelpiece in the living room. Once, a small framed photograph of my family, which I kept on my desk, was found lying face down, its glass cracked. These were not the actions of the wind or a settling house. This was deliberate, a series of small, unnerving pronouncements designed to unsettle me, to assert an unseen inhabitant's claim to this space. The whispers I heard in the wind now sometimes seemed to emanate from within the cottage itself, from the shadowy corners, from the locked rooms I hadn't dared to explore, particularly the old stone-flagged scullery that led to a boarded-up cellar door Josiah had warned against opening. And then there was the lighthouse beam. As the nights grew longer and the storms more frequent, my perception of it began to warp, to curdle into a specific, almost unbearable dread. Its rhythmic, sweeping arc across my windows, once a predictable, almost comforting metronome in the darkness, now felt like the cold, calculating gaze of an enormous, unblinking eye. It seemed to be searching, probing, not just the sea, but the cottage itself, and me within it. Josiah had written of his fear that the light called to the entity. Now, I understood what he meant. On the stormiest nights, when the wind shrieked and the rain hammered, the beam seemed to pulse with a strange internal energy, its light appearing almost to bend, to focus on specific points far out in the turbulent black water, as if illuminating a path or highlighting a target. I would find myself watching it for hours, a prisoner of its relentless sweeping cycle, my heart pounding in time with its rotations. Each pass of the beam across my window felt like a violation, a cold, spectral touch. I began to dread the coming of night, the activation of that automated, malevolent eye. It felt like it was drawing something closer, something from the spectral, light-strewn path Josiah had seen, something ancient and hungry, from the crushing darkness of the abyss. One night, the storm reached a particular frenzy, the cottage groaning as if it might be torn apart. I was in the study, trying to distract myself with Josiah's log, when the lighthouse beam swept past the window, its light unusually bright, almost blinding. In that brief, intense illumination, I saw it, or rather, the distinct, horrifying silhouette of it, pressed against the outside of the glass. A monstrous, elongated hand, its fingers impossibly long and thin, tipped with what looked like razor-sharp talons. The hand was there for only a fraction of a second, a perfect, terrifying negative against the brilliant glare of the beam. Then it was gone as the light swept onward, leaving only the rain-lashed, empty blackness of the night. I screamed, scrambling, back from the window, my chair crashing to the floor. It was a direct visitation, a clear, unambiguous sign that the barrier between my world and the world of Omen Point's horrors was dissolving. I spent the rest of that night huddled by the dying embers of the fire, a heavy iron poker clutched. In my trembling hands, every shadow a potential threat. Every gust of wind, the sound of that terrible hand scrabbling at the door, at the windows. The logbook lay open beside me, Josiah's frantic warnings a stark chorus to my own terror. The lighthouse beam continued its relentless, sweeping vigil, each pass a fresh wave of dread. The objects washing ashore, the things moving within the cottage, and now this, the horrifying glimpse of that monstrous hand in the lighthouse beam, all pointed to an undeniable, escalating truth. Omen Point was not just haunted by echoes of the past. It was a place of active, malevolent power, a conduit for something ancient and terrible. The tides of unease had become a flood of pure, unadulterated fear. The lighthouse, I now knew with chilling certainty, was not a beacon of safety, but the very heart of the darkness, its rhythmic pulse a summons. And I, alone on this desolate rock, was caught in its unblinking, predatory gaze, my solitude no longer a refuge for study, but a terrifying vulnerability. The question was no longer what secrets Omen Point held, but whether I could survive their full revelation. Sleep had become a foreign country, its borders guarded by the recurring, nightmarish image of that monstrous, taloned hand pressed against my window pane. Each sweep of the lighthouse beam was a fresh jolt of terror, a reminder of the horrors that Omen Point held. I existed in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every creak of the cottage, every sigh of the wind. The small store of courage I possessed was dwindling rapidly, replaced by a gnawing, pervasive fear. And then, the new storm began to gather, its approach heralded by an unnerving, preternatural stillness in the air. It broke not with the gradual escalation of previous tempests, but with a sudden, cataclysmic violence that seemed intent on tearing Omen Point from the very bedrock of the earth. The wind shrieked with the voices of 1,000 tortured souls, and rain, impossibly heavy, hammered down in solid, almost opaque sheets, erasing the world beyond my small, rattling windows. Waves, colossal and black, exploded against the cliffs below, sending tremors through the ancient stone of the cottage, each impact a brutal physical blow. The sturdy little house, which had once felt like a bulwark against the elements, now seemed a fragile, inadequate shelter. It groaned and shuddered under the relentless assault, the timbers crying out in protest, the very air inside vibrating with the storm's fury. I huddled by the hearth, the fire struggling to maintain its meager warmth against the invasive, bone-chilling damp that seeped through unseen cracks, a futile beacon against the overwhelming, elemental rage that sought to reclaim this lonely outpost. It was amidst this terrifying cacophony, as I watched the lighthouse beam struggle to pierce the impenetrable curtain of rain, that I first noticed its strange behavior. The rhythmic, dependable sweep faltered, the light stuttering, dimming for a heart-stopping moment before flaring back with an unnatural, almost painful intensity. Then, its steady rotation became erratic, sometimes speeding up, sometimes slowing almost to a halt, as if the ancient mechanism within the tower was being tampered with by an unseen, malevolent hand. This was impossible. The lighthouse was automated, its workings precise, designed to withstand the fiercest storms. Its erratic behavior was a deeply unsettling development, a sign that the forces besieging Omen Point were not just natural, but were actively interfering with this sentinel of light, perhaps even trying to control it. The beam, when it next swept past my window, seemed to possess a different quality, its light colder, more focused, imbued with a chilling, almost predatory awareness. As I stared, mesmerized and terrified, at the stuttering, pulsing beam, a sound emerged from the raging ocean that was unlike anything I had heard before. It was not the roar of the waves, nor the shriek of the wind, but a deep, resonant, almost guttural call, a single, impossibly loud note that seemed to answer the lighthouse's erratic pulse. It was a sound that vibrated deep within my chest, ancient and vast, the voice of something colossal, something that had slumbered for eons in the lightless abyss. Then, in a blinding flash of lightning that illuminated the entire tumultuous seascape, I saw it, or rather, a suggestion of it. A colossal, dark shape, far larger than any whale, briefly crested a mountainous wave far out at sea, its form indistinct, yet undeniably alive, before sinking back into the churning blackness. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it confirmed my deepest, most primal fears. The lighthouse beam was indeed a summons, and something was answering its call from the depths. The mist, which had held back during the initial fury of the storm, now began to roll in from the sea with an alarming swiftness. It wasn't the familiar, damp, white fog of Omen Point. This was a dark, oily, almost tangible vapor, coiling and writhing like a living entity. It pressed against the windows with a strange insistence, its tendrils seeking entry, carrying with it the faint, disturbing scent of brine and ancient decay. And within its swirling depths, I could hear those sibilant whispers, clearer now, more urgent. This mist felt sentient, an extension of the malevolent intelligence I now knew was focusing on this place. It was trying to encroach, to invade the small sanctuary of the cottage, to blur the lines between the storm-racked outside and my fragile refuge. I rushed to check the doors, the windows, stuffing old rags into any discernible crack. A futile effort against such an insidious, pervasive presence. The whispers seemed to be calling my name now, a chorus of sorrowful, enticing voices. A palpable, hostile intelligence permeated the very air I breathed. It was no longer just a vague sense of being watched, or the unsettling echoes of past events. This was an active, conscious mind, ancient and powerful, its attention fixed squarely upon me, upon the lighthouse, upon this tiny, vulnerable cottage. It was probing, testing, its immense, unseen pressure building against the fragile defenses of my sanity. The feeling was of being a tiny, insignificant creature under the microscope of a cold, curious God, desperate for any link to the outside world, any reassurance of normality. I fumbled for my satellite phone, my only connection to the mainland. The screen flickered erratically, the signal bar non-existent. I tried dialing, but the line was filled with a roaring static, like the sound of the ocean itself, and through it, a faint, distorted voice, cold and mocking, seemed to whisper my name, followed by a sound that might have been laughter, or the shriek of a dying animal. My blood ran cold. Even my last tenuous link to help was either severed or worse, corrupted by this encroaching presence. Mr. Finn's earlier probing questions, his unsettling knowledge, now seemed like a grim foreshadowing. Had the villagers of Seabrook Haven anticipated this, known that the storm, the entity, would eventually focus its attention so directly? Was my isolation, my terror, part of their ancient, horrifying pact? The lighthouse beam, now a sickly, greenish yellow hue, stuttered again, then fixed, its powerful lens turning slowly, inexorably, not towards the sea, but directly towards my cottage window. It stopped, aiming its full, unwavering glare into the study where I stood frozen. The light was no longer a warning beacon, but a focused, penetrating stare, an unblinking, malevolent eye that seemed to pierce through the walls, through my very being, searching, probing, exposing. In the heart of that terrible, focused light, within the giant lens of the lantern room, I thought I saw it. A distortion, a swirling within the illumination itself, the suggestion of a colossal, ancient, iris dilating, focusing directly on me. It was as if the entity from the deep was now looking out through the lighthouse's own eye, its ancient, unfathomable consciousness using the tower as a conduit, its gaze a tangible, terrifying pressure. The whispers filled the room, no longer swirling outside, but here, with me, urgent, demanding. The sentient mist seeped under the door, coiling around my ankles like icy tendrils. The cottage groaned, not just from the storm, but as if under the weight of that terrible focused gaze. I was trapped, pinned like an insect. The lighthouse itself transformed into the very eye of the ancient horror it was supposed to guard against, or perhaps to serve. The barrier between my world and its world was not just thin, it was shattering. The entity was no longer a distant threat, a legend in a dusty logbook. It was here, its attention fixed upon me, its power undeniable. The full, terrifying purpose of Omen Point, of the lighthouse, of the congregation's rituals, was beginning to dawn on me, and the weight of that understanding was almost too much to bear. I knew then that I could not simply endure this night, this storm. This was not a haunting to be weathered, but a confrontation that was being forced upon me. To survive, I would have to understand the mechanism of this place, the nature of the seal, the history of the sacrifices Josiah had only hinted at. The lighthouse's gaze held me captive, and the encroaching mist whispered of imminent, terrible revelations. My research into maritime legends had led me to become a part of one, a terrifying unfolding narrative with an unknown and likely horrifying conclusion. Omen Point was a place where the veil was not just thin, but torn asunder, and the ancient things that stirred in the deep had found a way to look through, to reach out. And I, it seemed, was what they were reaching for. The night of the lighthouse's terrifying, focused gaze had left me shattered, but also strangely resolute. The storm had finally broken by dawn, replaced by an eerie, preternatural calm. The sky a bruised, tender gray. The sea below sighed, its fury spent, but the air itself thrummed with a residual predatory energy. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that waiting passively within the cottage was no longer an option. Josiah Croft's logbook, with its desperate hints of foundations older than memory and stones that listen, was my only guide now. His frantic final entries had spoken of the original structure on Omen Point, something far more ancient than the lighthouse or the keeper's cottage, a place of power that the congregation of the tides had revered and utilized. If I was to understand the true nature of the lighthouse's seal, or the entity it supposedly contained, I had to find these remnants of a forgotten past. My academic training, my historian's instinct to excavate and analyze, now felt like my only weapon against the encroaching supernatural dread. Wrapped in oilskins against the damp, chilling air, I began my search. The ground around the cottage was a treacherous landscape of slick rock, salt-blasted turf, and loose scree from the recent storms. The mist, though thinner than during the tempest, still clung to the cliffs, swirling in eddies, sometimes revealing, sometimes concealing, the rugged contours of the peninsula. Each gust of wind seemed to carry faint, sibilant whispers, urging me on, or perhaps warning me away. Josiah's log had mentioned a sheltered hollow on the leeward side where the old stones drank the sea mist. After an hour of fruitless searching along the cliff edges, I found it. A slight depression in the landscape, almost invisible from the cottage, where a cluster of gnarled, stunted rowan trees clung precariously to life. And there, half buried, beneath centuries of accumulated peat and storm debris, were the stones. They were not the weathered gray granite of the cottage or the lighthouse tower. These were immense, cyclopean blocks of a dark, almost black, basalt-like rock, their surfaces unnaturally smooth in places, yet carved with deep, intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift if I looked at them too directly. They formed the unmistakable outline of a foundation, far larger and more ancient than the keeper's cottage, a structure that spoke of a grim, forgotten purpose. A profound sense of antiquity emanated from these stones, a chill that had nothing to do with the damp sea air. It was the coldness of ages, of rituals performed in darkness, of blood spilled and voices raised in supplication to things best left unnamed. As I ran my fingers over the deeply incised carvings, spirals, chevrons, and a recurring, unsettling motif of a many-tentacled eye, I felt a faint, almost imperceptible vibration humming through the rock. It was near the base of what might have been an altar, or a central plinth, half concealed beneath a thick growth of dark, oily kelp, apparently, washed there by the storm that I found it. My fingers, probing the damp earth, closed around something small, cold, and metallic. With a surge of adrenaline, I pulled it free. It was a small, heavily corroded bronze idol, no larger than my hand, depicting a grotesque, tentacled figure with a single, malevolent, staring eye. The idol was undeniably ancient, its surface pitted and scarred, yet it pulsed with a faint, almost nauseating energy, a sense of cold, alien intelligence. It was identical to a sketch Josiah Croft had made. In his logbook, a drawing he had labeled simply, "The Watcher from the Deeps, their God." Holding it, I felt a wave of dizziness, a fleeting vision of a torchlit procession, of robed figures chanting a guttural, inhuman invocation before a roaring bonfire on this very spot. The vision passed, leaving me trembling, the bronze idol cold and heavy in my grasp. This was no mere fisherman's superstition. This was a tangible link to the congregation of the tides, to the entity they worshipped. The whispers in the air seemed to intensify, the mist coiling around me more tightly, as if the unearthing of this artifact had stirred something, broken some unspoken accord. The rhythmic crash of the waves below sounded like the slow, deliberate breathing of some colossal, slumbering beast. Suddenly, a shadow fell over me. I looked up, startled, my heart leaping into my throat. Mr. Finn stood at the edge of the hollow, his silhouette stark against the gray, misty sky. He had approached with his usual uncanny silence, his weathered face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the bronze idol in my hand. He carried a coil of rope and a lobster pot, as if merely checking his traps. Yet his presence here felt anything but accidental. "Findin' treasures, are we, Miss Anya?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, devoid of any warmth. There was a new edge to his tone, a hardness I hadn't heard before. His gaze, when it met mine, was cold, assessing, and utterly devoid of the feigned concern he had shown on his previous visit. The charade, it seemed, was over. This place, these stones, they're from an older time, I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady, my mind racing. I held up the idol slightly. Josiah Croft wrote about this, about the congregation, about their God. Mr. Finn's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, understanding, confirmation, passed through his flinty eyes. "Some things are best left buried, miss," he said, his voice flat. "Old stones hold old memories, and old gods. They don't take kindly to being disturbed by outsiders." His words were a clear, unambiguous warning, no longer veiled in cryptic local folklore, but delivered with the quiet menace of someone who knew the price of transgression. "The villagers of Seabrook Haven," I pressed, emboldened by a desperate need for truth. "They still serve it, don't they? The offerings, the rituals Josiah described, they haven't stopped." Mr. Finn's lips thinned into a hard line. "The sea provides for those who respect its ways, Miss Anya. And the old one, it has always demanded its due. For centuries the pact has held. The point watches, and the village thrives." His admission, though chilling, was also a confirmation. The congregation was real, their pact ancient and unbroken. Omen Point was their sacred, terrible ground, and I was an unwelcome interloper, digging up secrets they had kept buried for generations. The knowledge was a cold weight in my stomach, a terrifying clarification of the danger I was truly in, not just from a spectral entity, but from its human servitors. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over me in the dark basalt stones. "Josiah Croft learned too much, asked too many questions," Finn said, his voice dropping to a low, almost threatening growl. "He disturbed the balance. The point, it corrected him. It always corrects those who don't belong, who don't understand their place in the old ways." The implication was horrifyingly clear. Josiah hadn't just succumbed to fear or madness. He had been silenced, a victim of the congregation, or perhaps of the entity itself, his fate a grim warning. And now, I, with his logbook and this unearthed idol, was treading the same perilous path. The mist seemed to close in, isolating us in this ancient, unholy place. "You do well to remember that, miss," Finn continued, his gaze hard. "Some waters are too deep to fathom, some secrets too dangerous to unearth. The sea always claims its own, one way or another. Best you stick to your books and leave the old stones to their slumber." His threat was palpable, hanging heavy in the damp, salty air. He then turned, without another word, and began to walk away, disappearing as silently as he had arrived, swallowed by the swirling mist, leaving me alone with the bronze idol, the ancient ruins, and the chilling certainty that my presence on Omen Point was not just known, but actively resented. The whispers on the wind now carried a distinct, sibilant menace, the voices of those who would protect their secrets at any cost. Clutched the idol, its cold metal seeming to burn into my palm. The discovery of these ruins, this artifact, had brought me closer to the heart of Omen Point's mystery, but it had also thrust me directly into the path of a living, watchful conspiracy, a human element far more immediately threatening than any spectral entity. My isolation was no longer just physical. It was a vulnerability that the Congregation of the Tides and their ancient, hungry god would undoubtedly seek to exploit. Mr. Finn's thinly veiled threat, his chilling assertion that Omen Point always corrects those who don't belong, hung in the damp sea air long after he had vanished into the mist. The bronze idol felt like a damning piece of evidence in my hand, a key to a history I was perhaps better off not unlocking. Yet his words had also solidified a desperate resolve within me. I could not remain a passive victim, waiting for the point or its human servitors to correct me. I needed information, leverage, perhaps even an unlikely ally, and the only place to seek that was Seabrook Haven. The next morning, the sea was unnaturally calm, the sky a pale, washed-out gray, as if the storms had momentarily exhausted themselves. I knew this fragile respite wouldn't last. I found Mr. Finn mending nets on the tiny, precarious jetty, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable, but he offered no protest when I requested passage to the village, merely nodding curtly and naming his price, his eyes never quite meeting mine. The journey was made in a tense, oppressive silence. Seabrook Haven emerged from the receding coastline like a forgotten relic of a bygone era. It was a small, tightly clustered collection of weathered gray stone cottages and fishing shacks, huddled around a tiny protected harbor. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, the only sign of life in the otherwise preternaturally still village. There was a quaint, almost picturesque quality to it, yet beneath that superficial charm lay an undeniable undercurrent of age, of secrecy, of something ancient and watchful. As I stepped onto the worn cobblestones of the main thoroughfare, little more than a narrow, winding lane, I felt the eyes of the village upon me. Faces peered from behind lace-curtained windows. Conversations ceased as I passed, and the few villagers I encountered outdoors, mending nets or gutting fish, offered polite but curt nods, their expressions guarded, their smiles fleeting and insincere. It was not overt hostility, but a pervasive, unsettling sense of being an outsider, an unwelcome intrusion into their insular world. The air here was thick with the scent of salt, drying fish, and ancient damp stone. But beneath it, I detected another fainter odor, the same subtle metallic tang I had noticed in the densest fog on Omen Point, a scent that now made my skin crawl with apprehension. It was as if the very essence of that cursed headland had seeped into the foundations of Seabrook Haven itself, binding village and point in an unholy symbiosis. And then I began to see them. the symbols, carved subtly into the weathered wooden lintels above doorways, painted faded and indistinct on the hulls of fishing boats pulled up on the shingle beach, even woven into the intricate patterns of the heavy fishing nets draped over stone walls. The same unsettling glyphs I had seen on the ancient ruins at Omen Point, the same tentacled eye motif that adorned Josiah Croft's sketches of the bronze idol. They were everywhere, a silent, pervasive testament to the village's enduring connection to the congregation of the tides. My feigned purpose for visiting was to replenish some basic supplies, and perhaps inquire at a local shop about historical records pertaining to the Lighthouse keepers. The village store, a dimly lit emporium smelling of dust, brine, and dried herbs, was tended by a gaunt, elderly woman with eyes as gray and opaque as a winter sea. She listened to my polite inquiries with a carefully blank expression, offering only vague, unhelpful answers, her gaze repeatedly flicking towards the small, potent idol I now kept concealed in my coat pocket. Her deflections were too practiced, ignorance too complete. It was clear she, like Finn, was a guardian of the village's secrets, well versed in turning away unwelcome curiosity. Every question about Omen Point's past, about unusual occurrences, or even about the more eccentric beliefs of past generations, was met with a polite but firm wall of dismissal. I felt a growing frustration, a sense of being subtly, expertly stonewalled at every turn by this united front of feigned normalcy. It was as I was leaving the store, a small bag of overpriced stale biscuits my only acquisition, that the shopkeeper spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "If it's old tales and true histories ye be seekin', miss," she said, her eyes not meeting mine, "ye might try a word with Mrs. Morwen. She bides up by the old chapel. She holds the memory of Seabrook Haven, she does. All of it." The suggestion felt less like helpful advice and more like a deliberate, calculated redirection. The old chapel stood on a slight rise overlooking the harbor, its stone walls encrusted, with lichen, its small arched windows dark and unwelcoming. Beside it, a tiny, immaculately kept cottage exuded an air of quiet, ancient authority. As I approached, the front door opened, and a woman emerged, so frail and ancient she seemed almost translucent. Yet her eyes, when they fixed on me, were startlingly sharp and bright, like chips of polished jet. This had to be Mrs. Morwen. She wore a shawl of a deep seaweed green, intricately embroidered with the same unsettling symbols I had seen throughout the village. Her smile was a network of fine wrinkles, a gentle, almost beatific expression that nonetheless sent a shiver of apprehension down my spine. "Miss Anya, I presume," she said, her voice surprisingly strong, resonant with an age that defied her, fragile appearance. "I have been expecting you. Please come in. The sea air has a chill to it today." Her cottage was small, a single room filled with the scent of dried herbs, beeswax, and the sea. Strange, primitive-looking charms and talismans hung from the low, beamed ceiling, and shelves were laden with ancient, leather-bound books whose titles I couldn't decipher. She gestured me to a small wooden stool by a peat fire that glowed, with an unnatural greenish hue, its warmth doing little to dispel the room's underlying chill. "You are troubled by Omen Point," she stated, rather than asked, her jet-black eyes fixed on mine with an unnerving intensity. "It is a place of strong currents, both seen and unseen. It does not welcome all visitors with equal grace." Her words were carefully chosen, each one laden with unspoken meaning, a subtle dance of revelation and concealment that felt far more dangerous than overt hostility. "I found a logbook," I said, deciding a direct approach was my only option. "Josiah Croft's." He wrote of the congregation of the tides, and of an entity, an old one of the deeps. Mrs. Morwen nodded slowly, her ancient eyes never leaving mine. Josiah was a man of much curiosity and little understanding of the delicate balance that must be maintained. The old one is a truth of this coast, as ancient as the stones, as eternal as the tides. And the lighthouse? I pressed. What is its true purpose? The logbook speaks of it as a pact, a channel. Her smile faded, replaced by an expression of profound gravity. The Lighthouse Pact, she murmured, her voice dropping to a near whisper, has kept Seabrook Haven safe for uncounted generations, miss. It ensures the bounty of the sea, calms the worst of the storms. Such protection, it always comes at a price. A balance, as I said, must always be maintained. Her words confirmed my deepest fears. The village, its people, they were not just aware of the entity. They were actively engaged with it, bound to it by some ancient, terrifying covenant. The price she spoke of, the balance, what did that entail? The image of the child's tooth in the locket, of Josiah's references to offerings, flashed through my mind with horrifying clarity. What price, Mrs. Morwen? I asked, my voice barely audible. She looked towards the small grimy window that faced the distant, hazy silhouette of Omen Point. The sea is hungry, child, she said softly. And the old one. It requires acknowledgement, a token of fealty, a reminder that we remember who truly rules these waters. The lighthouse helps to focus that understanding. Her euphemisms, her gentle, almost sorrowful tone, could not mask the chilling implications of her words. Seabrook Haven was not just a village. It was a cult, its existence predicated on a continuous, ancient appeasement of a malevolent sea god. And Omen Point, with its automated lighthouse, was the nexus of that pact, the place where the veil thinned, where the price was paid. I left Mrs. Morwen's cottage with her cryptic, ominous words echoing in my ears, the scent of herbs and ancient secrets clinging to my clothes. The polite, guarded faces of the villagers I passed now seemed like masks, hiding a terrible shared knowledge, a collective complicity in something ancient and unholy. Seabrook Haven was not a refuge. It was the very heart of the darkness I had stumbled upon. As Mr. Finn silently ferried me back across the now choppy slate-gray water towards Omen Point, I felt a profound sense of dread. Returning to the isolated cottage was no longer a return to solitude, but a return to the epicenter of this village's dark faith, to the very altar of their unspeakable pact. I was surrounded, not just by the vast, indifferent ocean, but by a conspiracy of silence, of ancient ritual, and of a hunger that emanated from the deepest, blackest trenches of the sea. And the lighthouse beam, I knew, would soon begin its nightly, watchful summons. The return journey from Seabrook Haven was a silent torment. Mr. Finn's stoic presence beside me a constant, unnerving reminder of the village's dark secrets and my own perilous position. Mrs. Morwen's words about the Lighthouse Pact and the price for their protection echoed in my mind, painting Omen Point not as a place of scholarly retreat, but as a sacrificial altar. The cottage, when it came into view, perched precariously on its cliff, seemed less like a refuge and more like a cage, awaiting my return with a cold, ancient patience. Back within its damp stone walls, the air felt heavier, charged with an almost palpable sense of foreboding. The sea, even in the temporary calm, sighed against the rocks with a sound like indrawn breath, expectant. I immediately turned to Josiah Croft's logbook, its brittle pages now my most vital and most terrifying source of information. Mrs. Morwen's cryptic pronouncements had provided a new, chilling lens through which to interpret his increasingly desperate scrawls, his fragmented observations. The symbols I had seen in the village, the tentacled eye, the spiral of the encroaching mist, they were all meticulously, almost obsessively, sketched in Josiah's later entries. He had connected them to the congregation of the tides, to their moonlit rituals, and to the strange, unsettling gifts the sea would sometimes cast upon the shores of Omen Point after particularly violent storms, gifts he eventually understood as tokens of the Old One's horrific bounty, or perhaps remnants of its feasting. His writings, combined with Mrs. Morwen's veiled admissions, began to paint a horrifyingly clear picture of the lighthouse's true function. It was not merely a warning beacon, nor simply a watcher's eye. It was a complex instrument, a focal point, designed and maintained through generations by the congregation to channel and appease the ancient entity from the depths. Its rhythmic beam, its precise location on Omen Point, were all integral to maintaining the fragile, terrible pact that kept Seabrook Haven from unimaginable horrors. Josiah had theorized, his script becoming almost unreadable with haste and terror in his final entries, that the lighthouse acted as a kind of psychic seal, or perhaps a carefully calibrated conduit. During periods of calm, it soothed the Old One with its steady gaze, a constant reminder of the village's vigilance. But during the great storms, when the veil between worlds thinned, its beam was used in rituals to direct the entity's attention, to offer it appeasement, to ensure its hunger was sated before it turned its wrath upon the village itself. The nature of that appeasement, the true price Mrs. Morwen had spoken of, was a truth I had subconsciously avoided, a horror my mind had refused to fully confront until now. But there, in Josiah's last, almost incoherent pages, stained with what looked like seawater and desperation, lay the answer. He wrote of the chosen, of the offering demanded by the turning of the deepest tides, of a soul for the solstice, storm to quiet the hunger below. It wasn't just trinkets, not just symbolic gestures. It was human sacrifice. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow, leaving me breathless, nauseated. The locket with the child's tooth, the whispers of vanishing ships and lost travelers, they all clicked into place with horrifying, sickening clarity. Omen Point was not just a place of worship. It was a place of slaughter, its history steeped in blood, its stones saturated with the echoes of terror, as if my understanding this final, terrible secret had breached some unseen barrier. The atmosphere in the cottage turned instantly, overtly hostile. A violent tremor shook the foundations, sending books tumbling from my makeshift shelves. The temperature plummeted, my breath misting in the air, and the whispers I had grown accustomed to rose to a furious, undeniable chorus of voices, angry, accusatory, and filled with an icy, inhuman malice. They swirled around me, clawing at my sanity. The heavy oak door to the study, which I had firmly closed, was flung open with such force it crashed against the stone wall, the wood splintering. The spectral, watery handprints Josiah had described began to appear on the walls, on the windows, on the pages of his logbook before me, glowing with a faint phosphorescent light, each one a cold, possessive touch. The entity, or its myriad, tormented echoes, knew I had uncovered its deepest secret, and it was enraged. Objects flew across the room. My pens, my carefully organized notes, even the heavy bronze idol I had placed on the desk, which skittered across the floor as if thrown by an unseen, furious hand. The dragging sound of chains from beneath the floorboards returned, louder, more violent, accompanied by a deep, guttural groaning that seemed to shake the very bedrock of Omen Point. The house was under siege, not from the elements, but from the awakened wrath of its ancient spectral master. Then, a new horror. As I stared, frozen in terror, at the open pages of Josiah's logbook, new words began to appear on a previously blank section of a page, an addendum written in a faint, shimmering blood-red script, as if by a ghostly, desperate hand. "It knows, you see." The words formed, shaky and urgent. "It knows you understand. The pact demands a price. The storm is its herald. Flee, if you can still find the path. Flee before the light calls you home." Josiah's spirit, perhaps, or some other trapped soul, was trying to warn me. The message was a chilling echo of Mrs. Morwen's words, a confirmation of my own terrible predicament. The light, the lighthouse beam, was not a guide to safety, but a summons to sacrifice. And I, the historian who had sought only to understand forgotten legends, had become the next potential offering, the next token of fealty for the Old One of the Deeps. The spectral hand I had seen before now appeared not just outside the window, but inside the room, coalescing from the swirling mist that was seeping in from every crack, its impossibly long fingers reaching for me, its touch an icy promise of oblivion. I scrambled back, a scream tearing from my throat, the poker from the hearth my only defense against this tangible manifestation of nightmare. The entity's presence was no longer a subtle dread or a series of unnerving occurrences. It was a direct, physical assault, a focused, malevolent intelligence intent on breaking my will, on claiming me. I felt its ancient alien mind pressing against my own, a suffocating wave of cold, despair, and an insatiable, terrifying hunger. It wanted not just my life, but my terror, my surrender. The wind outside shrieked like a banshee. The rain hammered against the cottage with the force of 1,000 fists. And the lighthouse beam, when it next swept past, seemed to pause, its cold, unwavering gaze fixed directly upon me through the study window. It was the eye of the storm, the eye of the entity, and it was watching, waiting, its hunger a palpable force in the besieged room. I was trapped, utterly alone, on this storm-lashed precipice, caught between an ancient, ravenous god from the Bible, sea and its human servitors in the village, who would undoubtedly see me as the perfect necessary sacrifice. The logbook's final, ghostly warning, "Flee before the light calls you home," was a death knell, for the light was already upon me, its cold, terrible gaze pinning me in place. The aggressive, direct nature of the haunting was a clear sign. My time for quiet research, for academic detachment, was over. This was a battle for my sanity, for my very soul. The knowledge I had pieced together from Josiah's tragic account and the village's dark secrets was no longer just history. It was my only potential weapon, my only desperate hope against the encroaching abyssal darkness. The next great storm, the one Josiah had hinted would bring the ultimate confrontation, the one that would demand the ultimate price, felt not like a distant threat, but an imminent, unavoidable certainty. And I, Anya, the historian, was now inextricably linked to the fate of Omen Point, a potential sacrifice to its ancient, bloody seal, unless I could find a way to rewrite its horrifying, endlessly repeating narrative. The days following the entity's direct assault were a blur of sleepless vigilance and frantic, desperate research. I pored over Josiah Croft's logbook, his terrified scrawls now my only lifeline, searching for any forgotten detail, any hint of a defense against the horror that Omen Point harbored. The air itself felt heavy, charged with an almost unbearable tension, the lulls between the frequent savage squalls offering no respite, only a dreadful pregnant silence, the calm before an even greater, final tempest. It began, as Josiah had foretold in his last coherent entry, on the eve of the winter solstice, with an unnatural stillness that fell over the sea and the land. The wind died completely, the waves smoothed to an oily black calm, and the sky above turned a sickly, bruised purple hue, as if the world itself were holding its breath. This was no ordinary storm gathering. It was an abomination, a perversion of nature, heralding the arrival of something truly ancient and unutterably malevolent. Then, the first colossal wave, appearing from a seemingly calm sea, struck the cliffs with the force of 1,000 thunderclaps, sending a tremor through the very bedrock of Omen Point. The sky ripped open, unleashing not rain, but a torrential, freezing deluge that felt like shards of black ice. The wind returned with a vengeance, a single, sustained, deafening shriek that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. Its voice, the scream of a dying cosmos. The lighthouse, my silent, stoic companion, groaned under the assault, its ancient, stone tower visibly swaying against the impossible fury of the wind. Its beam, which had activated with the premature, unnatural dusk, now seemed a pathetic, flickering candle against the overwhelming elemental chaos. The very air within the cottage vibrated, and the oppressive sense of the entity's presence, its vast, alien consciousness, became almost unbearable, a crushing weight on my mind and soul. As the storm raged, the already thin veil between worlds at Omen Point seemed to shred completely. The familiar dimensions of the cottage began to warp and shift. Shadows writhed with an independent, malevolent life, and the whispers that had plagued me were now a deafening chorus of voices, some pleading, some mocking, some promising oblivion, all speaking in a chorus of languages both known and horrifyingly alien. My own thoughts became a chaotic jumble, intermingled with intrusive, terrifying fragments of other consciousnesses. Objects within the cottage began to levitate, to spin, to shatter against the walls as if flung by unseen poltergeist hands. The temperature plummeted further, ice forming on the inside of the window panes despite the struggling fire in the hearth. The metallic tang of fear, of ozone, and of something else, something ancient, briny, and utterly inhuman, filled the air, making each breath a nauseating struggle. This was not just a storm, it was an invasion. And then, the entity began to manifest more fully. No longer just a hand at the window or a pressure in the air, but a tangible, horrifying presence. The walls of the cottage seemed to become translucent, and through them, I saw it. Or rather, glimpses of its immensity. Colossal, shadowy tentacles, larger than the lighthouse itself, writhed in the storm-tossed abyss beyond, their tips brushing against the cliffs, their passage causing the earth to tremble. Its vast, single eye, like a dying, malevolent star, seemed to fix upon the lighthouse, upon me. A voice, not of sound but of pure mental force, crashed into my mind, ancient and cold, speaking not in words but in images of crushing despair, of endless, lightless depths, of a hunger that had spanned millennia. It was a being of pure elemental chaos, its motivations unknowable, its power beyond any human comprehension. It considered me less than an insect, a fleeting, insignificant mote of dust in its ancient cosmic gaze. Isolated, terrified, I knew my only hope lay in Josiah's logbook, in the fragmented knowledge he had so desperately tried to record. I spread its brittle pages on the shuddering floor, weighing them down with stones, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows. His final entries were almost illegible, a mad scrawl of symbols, warnings, and desperate prayers. But within them, I had to find a key, a defense, a way to survive this apocalyptic night. He had written of the old rituals, the methods the congregation had used not to defeat the entity, for that was impossible, but to channel its attention, to offer it a specific focus, to sate its hunger temporarily, to reinforce the seal of Omen. The lighthouse was the key, its light, its rhythmic pulse. But something else was needed. A catalyst, a sacrifice, or a willing conduit. My blood ran cold as I reread his desperate, fragmented theories. Escape was a futile dream. The storm had cut off Omen Point entirely, the sea a maelstrom of impossible waves, the path to the jetty likely obliterated. To venture outside would be instant death, either by the elements or by the colossal, writhing presences I now knew haunted the darkness. Appeasement, the offering of a price as Mrs. Morwen had called it, felt like a horrifying capitulation, a path to becoming another lost soul, another trinket in the Grey House's collection. My only viable option, if any existed, was to try and reinforce the seal, to somehow use the lighthouse, the ancient ruins, the very power of Omen Point against the entity it served or contained. But Josiah's notes on this were terrifyingly vague, incomplete, as if he himself had recoiled from the full implications of what was required, or had been silenced before he could record it. He spoke of a conjunction, of the Warden's will, and of a heart of stone that must be reawakened. The bronze idol I had found in the ruins, its single, malevolent eye staring sightlessly up at me from the mantelpiece, pulsed with a faint, cold light, resonating with the storm's fury and the entity's terrifying proximity. The mother-of-pearl button, still clutched in my pocket, was warm, almost hot, its gentle thrumming a stark contrast to the idol's cold, dead power. Were these the keys? Were these connected to the heart of stone? The entity's mental pressure intensified, a crushing wave of despair and ancient alien thoughts threatening to shatter my sanity. I saw visions of civilizations crumbling, of stars dying, of vast cosmic horrors that dwarfed my own insignificant struggles. It was trying to break me, to overwhelm me with its sheer, unfathomable antiquity and its boundless, nihilistic rage. I clung to the image of Josiah's determined, though ultimately doomed, resistance. Then, amidst the chaos of his final, desperate scribbles, one phrase leaped out at me, underlined several times. The light repels, but the true light binds. The first keeper understood. The song of the deep must be answered by the song of the stone. The warden is the key. A song? A warden? What did it mean? The lighthouse itself was automated. There was no keeper, no warden, unless a terrifying, desperate idea began to form. In my mind, a wild gamble based on fragmented lore and a historian's intuition. Josiah had been a keeper, a warden of the light. He had failed. But he had left his log, his knowledge. And I, the archivist, the decipherer of lost stories, was now the inheritor of his terrible burden, his impossible choice. Perhaps the warden's will was not about a person, but about an act of conscious, understanding defiance. The Song of the Stone could refer to the ancient ruins, the foundation upon which this place was built, and the true light that binds. It couldn't be the automated beam, which seemed to be failing, or even corrupted. It had to be something else, something activated, something requiring intent. The bronze idol hummed with a cold, dark power, but the mother-of-pearl button, taken from the street of lost desires, felt warm, imbued with a spark of human hope, however fragile. The storm outside reached an impossible crescendo, the very air screaming. The cottage groaned as if its ancient stones could bear no more. The entity's presence was overwhelming, its vast, shadowy tentacles seeming to crush the very sky. This was it, the moment of ultimate confrontation. My decision, born of terror and a desperate, flickering ember of understanding, was made. I had to reach the lantern room of the lighthouse. I grabbed the bronze idol, its coldness a shock, and Josiah's logbook, its pages fluttering wildly. The mother-of-pearl button was a small, warm focus in my other hand. My plan was insane. A historian armed with crumbling paper and ancient relics against a cosmic horror. But it was the only plan I had. If Omen Point was a seal, and I was now its unwilling, terrified warden, then I had to try to bind what the storm had unleashed. With a strangled cry that was half prayer, half defiance, I threw open the cottage, door, and plunged out into the apocalyptic fury of the storm, towards the swaying, groaning lighthouse tower, towards the heart of the tempest, towards whatever terrible fate awaited me in the unblinking, malevolent gaze of the Old One of the deeps. My journey into maritime legends had reached its horrifying ultimate chapter. The journey from the cottage to the base of the lighthouse tower was a desperate, brutal battle against the apocalyptic storm. Wind tore at me with unseen claws. Rain and sea spray blinded me, and the very ground seemed to shift and heave with the entity's fury. I clutched Josiah's logbook to my chest, the ancient bronze idol a cold, heavy weight in one pocket, the mother-of-pearl button a small, warm spark in the other. Each step was an act of defiance, a refusal to succumb to the overwhelming terror that threatened to engulf me. The massive iron door of the lighthouse, usually rusted and stiff, was ajar, as if beckoning me into its shadowy depths. Inside, the roar of the storm was momentarily muted, replaced by an echoing silence and the rhythmic, labored groan of the tower's ancient stonework as it strained against the tempest. A faint, phosphorescent green light pulsed from the winding, stone staircase that spiraled upwards into darkness, the same unnatural glow I had seen on the spectral lights at sea. The ascent was a dizzying, terrifying climb. The air grew colder, thicker, with each upward turn, and the whispers I had heard before now seemed to emanate from the very stones of the tower, a chorus of ancient voices murmuring in forgotten guttural tongues. I felt unseen presences brush past me in the narrow darkness, their touch like icy water, their sorrow a palpable weight. The lighthouse was not an empty structure. It was a conduit, a prison, teeming with the echoes of centuries. Reaching the lantern room, I was met not with the familiar rhythmic sweep of the automated light, but with a scene of chaotic desolation. The great Fresnel lens was cracked, its intricate glass prisms shattered in places, and the powerful electric lamp within was dark, extinguished. Yet, the room was not entirely without light. A swirling, sickly green luminescence, identical to that on the stairs, pulsed from the very center of the room, where the light mechanism should have been, coalescing into a shimmering, unstable vortex of energy. This vortex was the heart of the storm, the focal point of the entity's encroaching presence. Through it, I could glimpse fragments of other, alien geometries, of vast, lightless abysses, and feel the crushing weight of an intellect so ancient and vast, it defied all human comprehension. The colossal, shadowy tentacles I had seen outside now seemed to be pressing against the thick glass of the lantern itself, their immense forms momentarily visible in the green, swirling light. Josiah's final, desperate words, "The true light binds. The Warden is the key. The song of the stone must be answered by the song of the deep," echoed in my mind. This swirling vortex, this was the song of the deep, the entity's raw, untamed power. I had to find the song of the stone, the true light. My gaze fell upon the central plinth where the lamp mechanism stood, its metal casing now cold and inert. This had to be the heart of stone he'd mentioned. With trembling hands, I placed the corroded bronze idol, the watcher from the deeps, upon that plinth. It seemed to settle there with a sense of grim homecoming, its single, malevolent eye staring up into the swirling vortex. The green light intensified, the whispers rising to a deafening shriek. The entity sensed the offering, the familiar totem of its ancient worship, and its attention focused entirely on this room, on me. But appeasement, I knew from Josiah's fate, was not enough. It was merely a precursor to consumption. The true light had to be different. I remembered the vision from the mother-of-pearl button when I had first stepped onto Sparrowwood Lane, the welcoming, warm light of a house that did not exist. That button, a relic from a place of ensnaring illusion, now felt different, its warmth a spark of human hope, of conscious choice against overwhelming despair. I took out the mother-of-pearl button. It glowed faintly in my palm, its warmth a stark contrast to the idol's icy chill. The Warden's will, Josiah had written. It wasn't about power, but about understanding, about facing the darkness with an unblinking human gaze, not to conquer it, but to define a boundary. The historian in me, the archivist of lost stories, understood. This was not a battle of force, but of meaning. Holding the glowing button aloft, directing its faint, warm light towards the idol and the raging vortex above it, I began to speak. I spoke not in the guttural chants of the congregation, but in the clear, steady voice of human reason, of historical understanding. I spoke of the pact, of the fear that had fueled it, of the sorrow it had wrought, acknowledging the entity's power, its ancientness, but also affirming the resilience of the human spirit, the sanctity of individual lives that it had so carelessly consumed. I spoke of Josiah Croft, of his courage and his terror, of his quest for knowledge. I spoke of the unnamed souls whose trinkets lay in the gray house of Sparrowwood Lane, and perhaps of those whose essence was trapped within the locket with the child's tooth. I spoke of the light of understanding, of remembrance, not as a weapon, but as a statement of existence, a refusal to be merely a vessel for ancient hunger. The true light, perhaps, was the light of conscious, empathetic memory against the dark of oblivion. As I spoke, the mother-of-pearl button in my hand grew brighter, its warm light expanding, pushing back against the sickly green luminescence of the vortex. The idol on the plinth began to vibrate, to smoke, a thin, acrid vapor rising from its bronze surface. The shrieking whispers from the vortex faltered, replaced by a sound of immense, surprised outrage, then a dawning, terrible confusion. The colossal tentacles outside the lantern glass recoiled as if burned. The light from the button coalesced, forming not a harsh beam, but a soft, encompassing glow that filled the lantern room. A light that felt ancient, yet deeply human, resonating with the very stones of the lighthouse. The vortex above the idol began to shrink, to contract, its furious energy dimming, its connection to the stormy abyss outside weakening. The house still shuddered, but the direct, malevolent pressure on my mind lessened, replaced by a vast, receding sense of ancient, baffled fury. It was not a banishment, not a destruction, but a rebalancing, a reaffirmation of a boundary. The button's light, the light of understood human experience, of history acknowledged, was perhaps the true light Josiah had sought, a force that could bind not through power, but through definition, by asserting the value of what the entity sought to consume. The Song of the Stone was the enduring human story, sung against the song of the deep. The storm outside began to subside, with an almost shocking suddenness. The wind's shriek softened to a mournful sigh. The torrential rain eased to a gentle patter, and the colossal waves began to retreat from the cliffs. The sickly green vortex above the idol dwindled to a faint, flickering ember, then winked out, leaving only the warm, steady glow of the mother-of-pearl button illuminating the lantern room. The immediate presence of the entity was gone, pushed back into the depths from whence it came. Exhaustion, profound and absolute, washed over me. I sank to the floor, the button still clutched in my hand, its light now soft and comforting. The bronze idol on the plinth was cold, inert, its single eye now just a dull, lifeless carving. I had survived. Omen Point had survived. The seal, in some unforeseen way, had been reinforced, not by sacrifice in the old way, but by an act of conscious, empathetic confrontation. But I knew, as I looked out at the first pale fingers of a bruised and weary dawn breaking over a calmer though still turbulent sea, that this was not a true ending. The entity was still there, in the lightless depths, its hunger eternal. The congregation in Seabrook Haven still held to their ancient pact. Omen Point would always be a place where the veil was thin, a place of watching, of waiting. I was marked by this night, by this place. The knowledge of what lay beneath the waves, of the true nature of the lighthouse's vigil, was a burden I would carry forever. I was no longer just Anya, the historian. I was the inheritor of Josiah Croft's lonely watch, a keeper of a truth far more terrible than any maritime legend I had ever studied. My thesis lay forgotten, its academic pursuits paling in comparison to the raw, terrifying reality I had faced. As the sun finally rose, casting a fragile golden light over the storm-scoured rocks, I knew my life had been irrevocably altered. I could leave Omen Point, perhaps, but a part of me would always remain here, bound to its ancient stones, its whispering winds, its sorrowful sea. The mother-of-pearl button was cool in my hand now. Its light faded, but its warmth, its small spark of defiant humanity, was now a part of me. The choice I had made in that lantern room, the keeper's choice, was not one of victory, but of a fragile, ongoing truce. Omen Point would continue its vigil, and I, its unlikely warden, would carry its secrets, forever listening for the whispers on the wind, forever watching the tides, forever knowing what slumbered and sometimes stirred in the crushing darkness of the deep. The lighthouse beam, when it next activated, would feel very different indeed. The storms still break on Omen Point's dark shore. The wind still carries cries I've learned to parse. Not just the seabird's lament, but something more. The ancient hunger 'neath unblinking stars. The lighthouse turns, a steady sweeping. I, no longer automated, cold, and stark. Its beam is now an extension of my sky, a fragile boundary against the endless dark. Josiah's log, a brother to my own, lies open in the lamplight's quiet grace. The bronze idol sleeps upon its plinth. Of stone, a slumbering malice in this haunted place. The button rests, a pearl against the gray. A human choice, a memory held fast, of how a fragile light once held at bay. The crushing shadows of a boundless past. The villagers of Seabrook Haven send their silent offerings upon the tide. Their fear, their faith, a pact that will not end, a secret that the shifting currents hide. And I, the keeper of this lonely keep, stand watch between the known and the unknown, while ancient things still stir within the deep, and Omen Point reaps what the years have sown. My thesis gathers dust, a distant dream of ordinary knowledge, simply sought. Now, other truths upon the sea wind gleam, with harder lessons, perilously bought. The point demands its due, its watchful gaze, and I am bound, by choice and by the night, to walk these cliffs through all my coming days, the solitary, warden of its fading sacred light.